Welcome to Establish the Edge. Excited to have a special Showdown episode this week. And if you are listening on the flagship Establish the Run podcast feed, I want you to know this is a simulcast episode of Establish the Edge. My podcast is another free podcast we have in the Establish the Run network. I am the King Spreadsheet Virgin, Mike Leone. If you're not used to hearing me on this feed, you can check out Establish the Edge for more deep dives that are going to be similar to the one we're doing on Showdown today. But we have them on, Dynasty, betting, DFS, small field tournaments, all that stuff. So make sure you check out Establish the Edge on iTunes. And if you are watching this on YouTube, please give us a like. This episode today, I've got two Showdown goats joining me. Establish the Run's Cody Main and Colin Drew, Drew B, formerly working with Sports Grid. Two of the best in the business. And we're going to attack this. It's close to the Super Bowl, so I figured we'd go through some high-level strategy. We're going to mix in some Super Bowl specific nuggets, but the main goal is kind of like higher macro type strategy. So I'll throw it to Drewby first. Drewby, thanks so much for coming out of Showdown retirement and joining me.
Happy to be here, especially with you, Mike, and with one of the main reasons I ended up retiring from Showdown and Cody. It's tough scenes when someone who creates such good content gets a huge platform from an edge perspective, but a lot of good discussions to be had. And probably the coolest thing about Cody is you can ask him any question. He's got all the data at his fingertips for Showdown, the true spreadsheet version of Showdown himself.
Yeah, Cody, thanks for joining me as well. Cody will have, I think is your Pro Bowl article up already?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why we're just straight up skipping past the God's game. It's just skipping right into Super Bowl Showdown is ridiculous here. We have a Pro Bowl article up on the site. It's obviously a ridiculous game. If you're playing it, it should be just for fun. But yeah, we'll be firing. And if you guys want to fire off too, it's up on the site. But a ton of fun over the next couple of weeks. A lot of Showdown focused content, and the contests are going to be really fun.
Yeah, and next week, Cody will have his Super Bowl Showdown breakdown, which is great. It has our projections, including our ceiling projections, the ownership projections. Cody's been dialed in a couple of weeks. I just can't believe the R squared on the ownership projection. So that's always a huge help. Has the range of outcome stuff mixed in there, as well as some notes on roster construction. We'll talk about macro roster construction today. Before we get into too much nitty gritty, just kind of want to talk to you guys how you got into your playing Showdown and how you've seen the game evolve. I know for me, I used to play Showdown a lot more than I have this year. I played kind of sparingly, of course, looking forward to degenning the Super Bowl, but it definitely seems like it's changed quite a bit especially in terms of how sharp the field has been and where your edge is at. Colin, I know I'm just gonna call you Drewby, so I stopped mixing names. Drewby, I know you had one of the probably craziest runs, not just in Showdown, but in all of DFS that I've ever seen. I don't remember what year it was or exactly when it started, but I think it was a Houston Texans Showdown slate you just smashed, and then it just the momentum carried.
Yeah, the funniest thing is if I dig back through my Showdown roots, the first thing I can find is an email that I sent to DraftKings responding to one of their offers to play Showdown. Just no thanks, not interested in a single game format. This is, and then fast forward to a year or 2 years later, and it was easily my single best format in any sport. And yeah, I had that 2-year run, 2018, 2019. I was winning a Showdown once a month, multiple 6-figure scores, but if a month went by and I hadn't shipped a Showdown, it was surprising. And it was chopping with 10 people, 15 people, but it was definitely lowly duped wins too, which is totally different. I'd say the biggest thing that has changed, in addition just to the content, is people get better and uncover edges. I think when I first was playing, there were, 15, 20, maybe 30 people who were 150 maxing these contests. And now almost all of the pros are in there. A lot of casuals are in there. So you're competing against a lot more people who are 150 maxing. And that's a big change too, especially as people get kind of deeper into the player pool. And a combination of those two things. I was also obviously running just on the hottest possible edge of the variance spectrum. So it was a combination of access to tools before people had them, access to strategy that people didn't have, and then just running at like the 99th percentile on the positive variance scale.
Yeah. What's crazy with Showdown is, I mean, it's almost win or bust if you're playing the big MME. I do kind of want to get like later on some of your guys' takeaways, how we can translate that to smaller field stuff. But, your success, like you had to be binking these contests. You can't just finish pretty well because they're really top heavy, and that's the nature of things. And you don't have to hit the pure nuts, but you kind of got to be close. And there's definitely some strategy tweaks you make when like hitting the nuts is actually on the table versus like a main slate DFS contest where hitting the nuts isn't on the table. The leverage aspect's different. But Drew, I felt like you really crushed early on with, as you said, you were one of the first people to 150 max routinely, but you did it in a way that really maximized the correlation of your lineups, like doing a lot of really smart things. If I have, captain wide receiver, I want to make sure the quarterback's in the lineup, or, max like one of the two running backs. And which is, of course, all this stuff's different slate by slate. But to me, one of the big changes seems to be like now that stuff that you did and really took advantage of seems to be a bit more commonplace. And it's almost like reversed
Very
to how do I decorrelate in a smart way so that I'm unique, where like the decorrelated lineups that are sharp are actually more likely to be unique, even if they're less likely to hit.
Yeah, the field has been picking up the rules and correlations a lot more over the years. The field also was originally overplaying quarterbacks substantially at captain, and so the even small things like just playing wide receivers at captain was a pretty substantial edge that is shifted away. And I think as I've evolved in my like thesis for Showdown this year, it was kind of still using perfect correlation on really contrarian lineups. So lineups that have some flyers or leave a lot of salary on the table, still kind of sticking to rules there, but ultimately on lineups that maybe are more popular in players or use more salary cap to try to break some of those correlation rules, which again is just going to introduce a bit more variance into your results, which is always tough to measure.
Cody, you were at Establish the Run when I joined. You predate me at Establish the Run.
I had to remind myself how far Drewby's run went back. Like, so I just Twitter searched his name and then typed in Showdown, and I was scrolling back through his Twitter feed, and it's just 100,000 score after 100,000 score after 100,000 score. So, I think the first podcast I listened to on Showdown, like the first content I consumed was Colin. So, I started in 2019, famously sending a cold email to Establish the Run support, like right after they had launched. Leading into the 2019 season, and then subsequently wrote 2,000 words on the 2019 Hall of Fame game Showdown slate. And I think at that point, like, I don't know who it was, Taylor or Wiggins or Adam, like decided I was crazy enough to at least let me come on board. And so, I grinded preseason for them a little bit and for the site. And then I think they realized that I was crazy enough to take on Showdown at that point. So I hadn't been playing Showdown in 2018 at all. So, Colin brings up like the content. And if you guys are following me on Twitter, like, posting out, top 1% rates and captain, utilization and things like that, that was all just born out of my curiosity and like me trying to get better, because I wasn't, I didn't have a track record of being a winning Showdown player. So just trying to establish a little bit of credibility. But, really from 2019 till now, like a lot of the things that you guys talk about with the field getting sharper and starting to use correlation more and making less obvious mistakes, which I think Drewby can mention, like the field is just making bad lineups back in 2018. Like just, they weren't doing the right things correlation wise. They were doing things that we obviously shouldn't be doing. Now that's obviously reversed. So I think you have to kind of change course a little bit. But if you were playing in 2018 and in 2019 and just playing like good, smart correlated lineups like Drewby was, then you were probably pretty successful. But the whole landscape has seemed like it's changed over the last couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And before we move on, talking about like mistakes and higher level thoughts, where do you think you've had the most success, Cody, playing Showdown?
Yeah, like I'm definitely not a football guy. Like if you're the king Showdown spreadsheet, or if you're the king spreadsheet guy, like I'm probably the Prince spreadsheet guy at ETR. Like I'm definitely a data nerd and definitely more into following that aspect of it and roster construction and macro trends. So I'm not good at picking sides. I'm not good at like discovering what type of wide receiver cornerback matchup is going to lead to like more usage for a particular wide receiver. So I'm more into trying to build as many good strongly correlated unique lineups as I can, and then kind of spreading out exposure along spectrum of how I think a game might come out. So like if I get a game script that I'm building for, then I've got a shot at a solo winner. So large field, multi-entry tournaments, whatever dollar range that fits your bankroll. Like for me, that's the, $10 and below. Like if I can max those tournaments, $5, $10, $3, and kind of spread out my exposure that way, that's where I've been most successful. I've gotten buried in single entry, and I don't know if that's just small sample, but or if I'm just picking games wrong. But I have not had near as much success in single entry. I don't know if I'm building too unique for those type of fields to have success, but definitely like the multi-entry large field tournaments is where I feel most comfortable.
Yeah. So one of the things I want to talk about is like the mistakes people are making in the multi-entry large field tournaments. I've got a couple that I've written down. One that I've hit on previously, I hit on it in Established a Million or on the 2-game slate, but I do feel like, and you guys feel free to disagree with me, but I feel like sometimes there's too much of focus on ceiling. People are used to playing the main slate where you need these 90th percentile outcomes from players to really differentiate from your opponents. And when you're talking about Showdown in a single game, like the game could suck and somebody still has to win, no matter what the game output is. There might not be, a Jamar Chase going for 7, 120 and 2, so there's a very decent probability that no one's hitting like their 75th plus percentile outcome. And I do think some people overthink this ceiling, not only in terms of individual player selection, but sometimes in terms of the correlation itself, where they're like, oh, I can't play Samaje Perine and Joe Mixon because, they're negatively correlated because they're 2 running backs on the same team, which might be true if you're looking at their 90th plus percentile outcomes. But there's plenty of, events where they both hit like their 60th percentile outcome, and that's like enough to get them in the lineup. So that's one that I felt was a mistake. The other one, and this is where I had a pretty good run that started after Drewby started, kind of, I guess, the tail end of Drewby's run. And honestly, I think like 90+% of the success of the run I had was I was playing onslaughts that people weren't playing. Like I was playing the 5-1, like 5 players from one team, 1 player from another team. And you actually put some data in our show notes, Cody, to kind of try and reflect the upcoming Super Bowl, but it's games between a 3.5 and a 5.5 spread. And basically, if you look at the percentage of lineups that play a 5-1 stack, the top 1% lineup is like positively leveraged, whether it's the underdog team or the favorite team. So it seems like that still might be the case a little bit. So any thoughts on that, Cody, with the roster construction stuff?
Yeah, and this goes back to like the first point that Drew mentioned with just doing like if lineups aren't kind of along the macro, like the 3-3, you can feel more comfortable doing a little bit more correlated stuff. So like those 1-5 lineups where we're talking 1 favorite and 5 underdogs. So like for this coming up slate, if you were just playing Cooper Kupp and 5 Bengals, I think with your 5 Bengals, you'd feel a little bit more comfortable properly correlating that lineup because such a small percentage of the field is going to be using that. But like, I'm sure I've posted this chart somewhere that total percentage of lineups that use this type of onslaught is so low compared to how often they're finding their ways into the top 1% finishing lineups. And that goes for something that like Adam and I have talked about on the Showdown shows as well, as 2-4 is kind of another one. It just goes back to this general thought that the field feels really good about these 3-3 lineups. And thinking about this game, you can get Cooper Kupp and Matt Stafford and maybe Cam Akers. And then on the other side, you've got T. Higgins and Joe Burrow and, maybe another cheaper Bengal there to make things work. But like you get this field that feels really comfortable with these 3-3 lineups and then feels really uncomfortable forcing these onslaughts. So they're really, really low owned. They don't necessarily project as well either. So anyone that's using an optimizer to run 150 probably isn't getting a whole lot of them either. So I think that's one macro trend that we should focus on, not just for this game, but going forward too, is getting more comfortable. Like if the game gets a little bit sideways in one way or another, like if the Bengals go out and win by 10 or 14, like, is it possible that 5 of them are in the winning lineup and maybe it's just Kupp on the other side? I think that's one way to think high level about how to approach this game specifically.
Yeah, and I think those outcomes occur like more frequently than people realize, just underrating the chaos of a single game. But it's not just that, it's that you can get paid off. Like you're making sort of like the optimal lineups in those scenarios. Whereas when the optimal lineup is a 3-3, you're competing, you're not necessarily getting paid off because you're just competing with so many other people. And again, that plays in a little bit with people overrating ceiling, where I feel like they think like, okay, well, I got to get, the Bengal stack and the Ram stack and like hit the nuts. And it's like, you're trying to beat your opponents. You're not trying to get the highest score. So Drewby, what mistakes do you think people are making, or any thoughts on like this ceiling roster construction stuff?
Yeah, I think the ceiling, like you said, 90th percentile is not going to happen every game, but usually there's going to be one player who hits his 75th or 90th, and a lot of the other players won't. And so the ceiling matters, I think, when you think about your captain or MVP selection more so than you think about the flex rules. And so if a player delivers their ceiling at the captain, what does that mean for the rest of the roster? I tend to agree the field plays projections, and they may alter their captain selections, but ultimately they're playing the projections. And so because of that, I think one of the edges I had early was constructing for alternate game scripts. I know Brian Jester, who I did podcast with frequently on Showdown, he also played for alternate game scripts. I was usually playing for like a standard deviation, like one way or the other. So maybe I played for like a Bengals win by 3 or a Rams win by 10-13, but I wasn't playing for a game going like 20 points under the total. But I think just generally the field is playing for the expected outcome more frequently than the expected outcome is going to occur. The field definitely still duplicates lineups way too much, maybe better than they have in the past, but a lot of people are using the full salary. They're using 4 or 5 marquee players that fit the rosters and are good values. And if you're building a cash game lineup, they're kind of the first people in there. But a lot of people are unwilling to kind of take the chance on the third or even the fourth wide receiver. The guy might only play 20-30% of snaps, and they're not willing to kind of bet on the big plays happening. And well, as an individual play, those don't get there that often. When you consider all of the plays that look like that in a single game, it comes through more frequently than the field is typically playing them.
And you brought up the ceiling mattering a bit more for captain choices. So I do want to talk about captain a little bit. And also hinges on something else you said earlier about, the field getting sharper with quarterback play, but also playing the projections. I think part of the reason in the past the field overplayed quarterback in the captain spot was because by base projection, they're almost always going to have the highest projection on their team. But that's where you have to think through the range of outcomes where, okay, well, let's say we've got Burrow for 22 points and we've got T. Higgins and Jamar Chase for like 18-ish each, Tyler Boyd for 13. Like the odds of a pass catcher, one of the 3 pass catchers beating Burrow is more likely than not. So, and generally the quarterback, because they have a more consistent base production, the quarterbacks are going to be more expensive. So you're losing value in the captain spot, and you have a good bet of them being like top 3, which, like, again, if you're playing small field or something, like maybe that matters a little bit more. But when we're after the pure nuts, the dynamic shifts some, where you want the top scorer, and especially if quarterbacks can be overplayed. This late in the Super Bowl in particular, I don't, Cody, the quarterback stuff seems tough because you've got 2 pretty firm pocket passers. I know we saw Burrow move around a little bit the last game, but his rush yardage over under is like 10 yards. So what do you think about quarterback specifically in captain, and just any other notes on your captain selection?
Yeah, I looked at this before we hopped on because I was kind of curious how things shook out by the end of the year. And when you kind of group out, because I think we have to like look at quarterbacks in 2 bins, you kind of have to group out the Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, Kyler, and Jalen group from that, because people know like the Konami code quarterbacks, if you will, that have the rushing upside get treated totally different in Showdown than your standard pocket passers like we have in this slate. So once you group those guys out and you look at the remaining quarterbacks, like the Staffords and Burrows that are true pocket passers or more so pocket passers, you have seen a pretty big drop off in captain utilization. Like people are, I think, figuring that out, that you should play them in flex almost always, but that it's more optimal to play their wide receivers and even tight ends in some cases, given the ownership that we're getting as a captain, just because the pass catchers are more likely to outscore them if we get their 75th or 80th percentile ceiling. So I'm a little bit more down on quarterbacks, but if we get to this point, like where we're starting to see, sub 5% captain ownership projections on guys like Stafford, at that point, it starts to make a little bit more sense for me. I think it becomes more important on how we play those captain quarterback lineups, because I think we're still seeing the field make big mistakes when they do play captain quarterback. Too much of the field is playing their captain quarterback teams with 0 or 1 pass catchers. And like when you think about how that's going to work, like if you have Matt Stafford as your captain and just pair him with Cooper Kupp, like it's so much more likely that if that situation happens where both of those guys are in the optimal lineup, that it's just those two, that it's flipped, that Kupp would be your optimal captain, that Stafford would be in the flex. So if you are playing captain quarterback, I highly would recommend, whether you've got Stafford in there, you will probably want 2 or more Rams pass catchers. And then similarly with Burrow, although he's got, a little bit more rushing upside, but if you got Burrow as your captain, you want 2 or more Bengals pass catchers almost always.
As far as kicker defense stuff, talking about range of outcomes, like, do you ever play those in captain? I know, Cody, you're always joking about the field overplaying DST, and then you're just kind of accepting those burials the few games where it happens. What's your research shown at those positions?
It's tough because when it doesn't feel as optimal, and we know how hard it is to project DST scoring, but when it doesn't feel as optimal, like in a game with a 48.5 point total and good offenses like this one, it's harder to allow those to naturally happen when you're running 150. But I think that's when it's better to do it, especially as cheap as they are in this slate. It's when the Patriots are like $6,400 and 12% owned at captain. That's like what I have a problem with, is people just jam that in thinking they can accurately predict when, we're going to get like 2 defensive touchdowns, right? So it is more used by the field than it does land in top 1% lineups, but it's pretty close. So I don't scoff at it as much as I used to, just because I understand like the unique nature of doing it. I just think that when people get really confident in using DST as like the absolute time to fade, and then in situations like this is where I'd be more okay allowing it to happen naturally. Although I don't think it would happen much like on a slate like this, maybe 2 or 3% of each max,
Yeah. Drewby, is the GOAT Evan McPherson gonna? I can see this dude's ownership getting jacked up. He's got 3. Like if you look at his game log, he's hit 4 field goals in 3 straight games. He's got the 50+ yarders. Anything you've uncovered with kickers, or even I'm pretty sure they're negatively correlated, like using them together. This is getting away from the captain in particular, but even in the flex spots.
Yeah. So the captain, like 2 things I'm looking for. One is, or I guess 3 things. One is ceiling for the captain, leverage in the field, ability to build some type of correlation rules, or at least understand how the field's going to correlate them. I don't really get that with DST. Maybe some correlation rules, you get it a little bit, and I don't really get that with kicker. And so even if there's like a edge case to make an argument that basically what you need to have happen is a lot of the studs in the slate have to put up good games, but within a tight range of each other. So it would mandate having all of them in the winning lineup. And therefore your low score allows you to squeeze players in there. And so it's just like, it takes a perfect storm. I typically don't do it. I think there was one Chiefs slate where I might've done it earlier this year for like 5 lineups or something like that, but not typically using those guys in the captain spot. I think the negative correlation, like I used to use hard groups on things like that, like the, max 1 kicker or max, 1 of the kickers in DST in the game. Gotten away from that a little bit, rather use some key boost rules to negatively correlate, especially a slate like this. This slate is really starved for value. So both the teams run pretty condensed offenses, tight rotations, even as far as snap counts are concerned. And the backup tight ends, whether they start or they're backups, they've been priced up. So there's not really a lot of value on the slate. And because of that, you can start to see some of the rules get broken and maybe see like 2 kickers being a bit more viable than I would typically think they are.
Yeah. I want to talk about the lack of value in a second, but sticking with captain stuff, and you said you're correlating off of the captain is interesting.
Or not correlating, but knowing how the field's going to do it is like,
right. So one that's kind of interesting. I might be jumping to Galaxy Brain before covering the bases, but like I was already looking at like Cooper Kupp captain without Matthew Stafford, for example, where when you get these guys, there was a slate last year. I was really close to doing this and winning with Allen Robinson as captain on the Bears without Foles, which was a little bit of a different situation. But the alpha pass catchers that can, with the full point per reception and the 100-yard bonus, you can get there almost without scoring in the captain spot. Cup in this game is probably going to have to score, but like, I don't know, like 10 for 130 is what, 26 DraftKings points, and even if he gets one touchdown and let's say, in Stafford, that's fine. Like he could have 50% of the team's yards and an absurd amount of catches and really pull away. And then like maybe the Burrow, stack goes off. And so that's one. I think like normally you would say, okay, captain wide receiver, my rule is going to be I have to use his quarterback. I think when you get a guy like Cup, where the yardage bonus and the sheer amount of volume of catches he can have as to his score, like that's a spot where you could get unique.
I think it helps to like look back at historical rates on this stuff too, just to see how often the field is doing it, because this is something that I talked about, and I know Colin had thoughts on, like maybe it was last year or even 2 years ago, that I was not necessarily recommending this, but something where I had stopped utilizing the like absolutely locking in if captain wide receiver pair with the quarterback. I just stopped using that rule because I was seeing more of what you're talking about happen. But with a little bit bigger sample, we've seen 85.2% of top 1% lineups pair their captain wide receiver with the quarterback, compared to just 77.4% of the field. So the field is doing like what you're talking about with Cup more often than it's winning now. So you're not getting paid off as much in terms of like getting unique, which is kind of flipped from a little bit before. So I don't know if more people are trying to utilize that a little bit more than we would expect it to happen. But you do get paid off with a little bit fewer dupes, like 9.8 dupes on average for captain wide receiver with the quarterback versus 4.9 on average for captain wide receiver naked, if you want to call it that. So you are getting paid off a little bit, I guess, in that sense, but it's just not happening frequently enough compared to how often the field is using it. But Cup is like one of those guys that would be able to do it, where he just accounts for so much of the team's receiving production that no one else scores well enough. And maybe Stafford doesn't do enough outside of just throwing to Cup to himself land in the optimal lineup.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Generally agree with that. I was just going to add, I think the field mostly will do it with a Cooper Kupp or a Devontae Adams. So they're more willing to do it when it's an alpha wide receiver with 30% plus target shares. They're a lot less willing to do it if it's Jamar Chase with Matthew Stafford, for example. So just some things to consider. And a lot of this stuff, like it's science and art. Like it depends. Are you going to ship the solo milli in like, or are you trying to put together something that you think is, plus EV? And if you chop it like 50 ways for 20K, like that's cool, or 30K, that's cool. So part of that is just like, I guess, overall philosophy too.
Yeah, absolutely. And zooming out, I do think if you're playing more traditionally, if you have a captain wide receiver, you want the quarterback in flex, and then you also probably want to limit the amount of other teammates in flex, like just understanding that receiver is going to take a high percentage of points. And then like, as we hit on, if you're making the quarterback the captain, it's almost the reverse, where you probably want multiple teammates in the flex, because it's going to be multiple passing touchdowns likely spread out, not to one person, because if it was to one person, that person would be the captain.
Yeah. And I think a lot of people listening to this are probably playing for the first time, or they're not playing Showdown 150 max all the time. And then there's some who are probably nerding out like Cody and I have. But I think the optimal way to play a wide receiver captain would be to pair him with a quarterback and pair him with at most one other pass catcher from their team. That's probably what comes through the most consistently, often, still provides some positive leverage on the field, and sets up and maximizes the correlation of the lineup. A lot of nuances there, but if you're just looking for a simple way to maybe hand build a 3-max team, that's kind of how I think about the wide receiver captains.
Yeah, and I think that one might seem intuitive, like just maxing out how many pass catchers you pair with your captain wide receiver, but it's really important, and the data bears it out. Just 7.9% of top 1% captain wide receiver teams use 2 or more same team pass catchers. So like you talked about, if you're building just a good sound single entry 3-max team, captain wide receiver plus quarterback and at most one wide receiver is a really, really, really strong lineup.
Running back captain is tough, where I think like there's an inclination to want to max one running back from the same team if you have captain running back. But with the especially for like a slate like this where the value's starved a bit more, and we've also got guys that are going to play passing downs kind of specifically, like I don't think Samaje Perine, maybe catching 3 or 4 balls is going to prohibit Joe Mixon from being the captain running back. Anything you guys see at the running back position when using, like a Mixon or Akers type at captain, either generally or specific to this game?
I think a lot of it comes down to like your total salary and then what they need to do to hit a 75th percentile, or whatever we're looking for. Let's just say we're aiming for a 75th percentile, and then their salary adjusted output that they would need, and then their teammates' salary adjusted output to also land in the same lineup. So yeah, most often if you're just building sound, really good correlated lineups for Showdown against single entry 3 max, captain, running back, and then excluding their backups makes the most sense. But I think we've got a pretty compelling slate coming up. And I don't know where we have the breakdown on the site between Akers and Michelle, but like if you have an Akers captain team, and I think Sony Michel is 5K, like can he also do enough if Akers is the optimal captain to land in a winning lineup? Sure, he probably can. And then similarly with Mixon, I think he's in the 9Ks, and then Perine's one of the actual cheap values that we have on this slate. And we saw him break a 40-yard touchdown pass last week. Like he doesn't have to do a whole lot to crack the optimal lineup in that case. It's less likely to happen, but it's not something specifically for the Super Bowl that I would be grouping out at all.
Yeah, the pricing's really tight, and I want to talk about the riff-raff. That's what we called it in FFPC. Like these low probability chance of hitting players, but in the Showdown format, I think they matter. Whereas if you're playing a main slate, let's say like someone like, Ben Skournick, or like that, and even take Ben Skournick out of it, but like just any like really fringy player who maybe is in the optimal lineup, let's say 3% of the time, and they're going to get played 0% of the time. Like in theory, that'd be positive leverage, but it's not worth it on a main slate where it's like, okay, 3% of the time, maybe you're gaining like 1 or 2 points on the field. No one's hitting the nuts anyways. When you're playing Showdown, it doesn't matter by how many points you win by if you hit the nuts. And if one of these, really cheap guys, like let's say Tyler Higbee's out and, Perkins or not Perkins, Hopkins. Let's say Hopkins at 200 just, catches a few balls. Like it's a tight slate. Like 2 for 20 could get in the optimal lineup, and you're not really care about the raw total of points. So in general, how many of like the fringy guys do you use? Usually we get more. There's not a lot. Like I'm looking on this slate, the guys I would consider real fringe would be if Uzama and Higbee are out, everyone understands that Sample and Blanton are the value tight ends on each team, but the second tight ends are going to play. I think it was Mitchell Wilcox who played for Cincinnati last week after Uzama went down. Hopkins, I think, is expected to be the second guy. I don't believe he was even active last week, but would expect to be the second guy if Higbee's out. Usually we get some other wide receivers too, but on the Cincinnati side, like, Mike Thomas might play a snap, but like he's, I think he's an X out guy. But Skournick I mentioned because like he will actually get a few opportunities. I mean, he almost had a long touchdown last game. He will see the field. Van Jefferson doesn't seem like he's 100%. So how do you approach those types of players in general? And then on this slate, like, am I missing anyone? Or is it just, those 3 as far as like the pure punts?
Yeah, I would say generally the field has started playing those guys a bit more during the regular season, but I think the Super Bowl especially is going to be an influx of more casual people, and they're definitely not going to be playing a lot of these guys. They don't have to do much either is the thing. They don't even have to score a touchdown. So in the San Francisco LA game, Trent Sherfield was 1 point off of the optimal lineup with a 0. Mohamed Sanu was 1 point off the optimal lineup with a 0. Either those guys catches a pass or gets a jet sweep for 0.2 yards, and all of a sudden you're looking at the potential for a solo win. And so you want guys that are seeing the field, obviously. That is an important thing, or have potential to see the field, but they don't have to catch a touchdown. And then especially when you talk about these tight end twos, like they're going to be involved in a lot of these goal line pass, packages with play actions. Like Tommy Sweeney was one of the Buffalo guys that was pretty close to binking like a solo showdown earlier. And so I definitely am really interested in the guys who are involved at the goal line, the tight end twos in the offense. But I think you can even go deeper than that, especially if they're priced cheap. They don't really have to do very much. They just need the right price skill guys to blow up. And then all they might need is a single, catch or run.
So the Trent Taylor 2-point conversion could get you there. And I mean, I was just messing around with different lineups to like get a feel. Like you throw in like a Burrow, Higgins, Chase stack, like with none of those guys even at captain, and like, I mean, you're up against it, and that's a pretty reasonable pairing to want to start with. So it is tight. And so to Drewby's point, if the right game plays out and the volume's concentrated on some of these expensive players, a catch might get it done. Cody, how do you view the riffraff?
Yeah, I'm curious, like Colin's thoughts on this too, because I haven't actually looked a whole lot into the data on like how often these guys crack the optimal lineups and like what type of game environments they do crack optimal lineups in. But like intuitively, my thought is if they are, it's probably in a lower scoring game environment where like the one jet sweep for 10 yards or like the 2-point conversion catch or the one catch for 5 yards and a touchdown is going to crack.
The studs going off though, don't you think?
So like if you have a high scoring game environment, right? Won't you get enough of those in theory, right? Won't you get enough of those 4, 5, 6K guys that score close enough to the studs? Like, won't we get enough of the Van Jeffersons and Blantons if he's in, and or would it just be this situation where it's Chase, Cup?
I do think it's like these tweener games where there's going to be enough scoring from high price players, but they're not easy to fit in together.
Sure.
And they all score kind of similarly. So you need them all.
Yeah.
And like you said, you can't have like the McCole Hardman or Demarcus Robinson's putting up like 15 points. Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I mean, if whoever the backup, if Hopkins catches a touchdown in this game, I'd feel pretty confident he's in the optimal lineup, especially if you're dipping into like the quarterback double stack and you need salary. It's like a pretty nice way to punt it is also just to toss like one of the 0 to 2% owned punts on their team into that lineup, get a little bit of correlation in there. If they throw the 3-4 touchdown game, you have a punt as well.
Yeah, and those guys will be super low owned. Like sometimes there's some name value to like these sub 1K guys, but Skowronek and these backup tight ends who we don't even know are going to play. Like it's going to be sub 2-3% ownership, which is really nice.
Yeah, it's really interesting that I know we both are 150 max guys. The single entry dynamics are pretty interesting too, because if there's an obvious value, and I'm not sure who the best example of that would be in this game. Maybe it's one of the kickers or maybe it's like Tyler Boyd, but those guys in single entry go through the roof. So like in those Chiefs games, if like Demarcus Robinson is $1,000 cheaper than Mecole Hardman, Robinson in single entry will be like 60% owned and Hardman will be like 5%. And so that I think is a pretty interesting thing to think about as well. Same thing at the quarterback level. Like Mike, you want to play a Thunderdome showdown? I bet you get Joe Burrow at 2%, 3%. Like people just aren't going to play the quarterback captain on the underdog in a single entry environment.
And what's interesting is I don't need to hit the nuts, right? Like Burrow could have a really strong game, and like I don't have to choose between Chase or Higgins as my captain play, right? Like or I guess it'd even be hard to double stack them with Burrow at captain because the pricing's so tight. But I could get that leverage with Burrow having a huge game. Maybe a wide receiver is more optimal than he is, but in a small field, I don't need every single point. Like I might have gained enough on my opponents that I make up for not having the optimal. And I have the guy that's more likely to be like a top 5 captain piece who's way too low owned. So I do think the single entry stuff's interesting. Cody, you had said you wondered if you were going too unique for like the smaller field single entry stuff. We're having trouble there. And I feel that because it does feel like there's an unlimited amount of ways to get different. You can try all those in 150, but it's like, do I go different at captain, or like, do I play the chalk captain and like just play one of these value guys that's just flip one of the value guys that's going to be different? It does, like, that's the trouble I've had when I wanted to play. And that's the type of showdown I do want to play more consistently moving forward, is less of the MME stuff and more of the single entry stuff. But it's how do I guess, hone in on, the best pivot to make when there's like a laundry list of potential items?
Yeah, and I think the things that we talked about with large field in multi-entry, with everyone using optimizers and 150 maxing and dipping deeper into the player pool, like you don't have that problem with single entry, especially if you're planning on playing the dome for this one, you're not going to have that problem. But I think in the large field stuff, you're seeing combinations of all of the things that we talked about today, like the uncorrelated pairings in leaving salary on the table and balancing ownership and finding these super low owned punts to use. Like you need to combine all of that generally in a single lineup to get unique. In single entry, I think I'm doing too much of that, where like you can do just pull one or two of these levers. Maybe it's leaving salary on the table, but still building a really good correlated lineup. Maybe it's doing like what Drew B mentioned and just flipping captains, where in the dome, wide receiver captain's going to get outsized projections in terms of ownership, and Burrow would be really low owned. I don't think you need to go as crazy because we're so hyper focused on being unique in Showdown. I don't think you need to go as crazy in the single entry 3 max smaller field stuff. And I think that's probably been my biggest problem, but just focusing on pulling one or two of those levers, whether it's ownership or finding the one pivot or salary, just not getting way off the board in these smaller field things, because you can still build good lineups while not being duped.
But yeah, to Drew B's point, it is going to be like a main slate when all the cash games guys get condensed into small field, single entry stuff. People are playing their cash game lineups. Like, so there's going to be opportunities that condensing might even happen at a higher rate. Like I'm very curious what Cooper Kupp would project to be in a small field in terms of ownership. Like I imagine
100%. It'll be
yeah,
yeah.
And the pricing
You're the one.
tight. Like, I mean, the pricing's so tight that I'm like, well, if the Burrow double goes off, or I don't know. So it's, I wish Cup was a little bit more expensive, actually. It's pretty crazy looking at this is a tangent, but the Cup Stafford game logs, Cup doesn't have very many games where he didn't beat Stafford, and the ones that he didn't were close, at least last that I looked. I maybe didn't see the full set, but pretty nuts for a wide receiver quarterback combination. All right, so we just talked about getting unique, but getting unique in these large field tournaments, we've dabbled a little bit about leaving some salary on the table, maybe even decorrelating sometimes. I know there were slates with Kansas City. I think you mentioned this, Colin, but there were slates with Kansas City where I'd play, Tyreek and Kelsey without Mahomes, where they actually became some of the higher projected lineups I could play that I didn't expect to be duped. And first of all, like the way to even figure out if you're going to be duped, the sum product ownership seems to be like the best way, where you're literally just multiplying the projected ownerships of the 6 spots in your lineup times the number of entries in the field, especially when you're talking, was it like a 400,000? I mean,
450,000 or 470,000. It's crazy.
But then one thing I learned from Drew B was to make some adjustments to those projected dupes, where if I was leaving salary on the table, I lowered the likelihood of those teams being duped. If there were some correlations, flags that weren't met, I lowered the likelihood. And that was a real big improvement in my MME set back when I was playing it a little bit more consistently, because I had been almost going too far. And I was actually like Xing out some really good lineups that weren't being played a lot, because they left salary on the table where they weren't correlated in a certain way. So like functionally, if I'm trying to, limit the amount of lineups that I'm playing that are dupe, what do I actually do, Drewby?
Yeah, so I think you kind of nailed it. You basically have the product of the ownership of the individual players. So whatever the captain projected ownership percent is, and then the flex percent, projected ownership percents for the other players. Multiply that together, use some type of correlation coefficient. So if you want to do the QB, wide receiver with their QB, maybe it's 0.85 if you stack them and 0.15 if you don't. And then you have some type of salary multiplier based on how much salary you're leaving on the table. And those, I think, are the 3 things. If you multiply that by the field size, you're going to get directionally in the right area. For the QBs, if you're stacking them, I think you can do some interesting things. If you single stack or double stack, like maybe maybe Stafford's 10%, but Stafford double stacks are actually only going to be used by 40% of the Stafford people. And so you could do some things there where, or the triple stacks are used by like 5 to 10%. And so you can do some things there where even if the individual Rams wide receivers are popular, the combination of the triple stack will make it less so. So I think those are kind of functionally the things you're looking at. Obviously, you got to be a bit of a spreadsheet nerd to get down to that level. And I think the biggest thing you said, though, is the product of the ownership. And so like 1% guy and a 20% guy is going to make a pretty big difference. Even if the 20% guy is more popular, like that's going to be a lot less duped than if you're going with like 10% guys, just as a off the cuff example.
Cody, any follow up there?
Yeah, and I think like for people that don't, we just talked about product ownership, and I think most people get it at this point, especially if you're grinding Showdown hard. But if you're using optimizers, or if you just heard people talk in the past, most people talk about total ownership or cumulative ownership, and that's far less predictive of product ownership, or than product ownership is of predicting how many dupes you should have. So there's a 0.55 R squared between product ownership and number of dupes, which is really pretty strong when we're talking about just one single variable, and a 0.26 R squared between total ownership and dupes. So it's just one of those mechanisms that you can use that, like Drewby talked about. 10% guys in the same lineup is way different than 20% guy and 1% guy, or on a bigger scale, like 40% guys equal 80% total ownership, and a 75% guy and a 5% guy equals 80% ownership. But the product ownership is way different for those two groupings. And the other thing, like if you're playing these lineups that, like Drewby talked about, with Matt Stafford with 3 pass catchers that aren't going to be used by a whole lot of the field, I don't think you need to go crazy in your remaining spots, because you're already kind of unique enough that like you don't need to leave in those lineups 5K on the table or something like that, or like then roster another 2% guy on top of that. Just understanding like how many of these uniqueness levers you need to pull on any individual lineup is going to help you actually build good lineups that are still unique without building these crazy way off the board lineups that have a really low probability of winning. But yeah, you're unique because you've done all these things. Like you've done the Stafford triple stacks with 3K left on the table, and you've got a 2% owned guy. Great, you're unique, but it's really, really low probability of winning. Like if you're just doing these things in conjunction with each other when they make sense on the right lineups, then I think you've got a good chance of being unique while still building strong correlated lineups.
Yeah, and Drewby, I believe Jester, who you had talked about earlier, who will play some extreme game scripts, actually solo took down the million last time the Rams were in the Super Bowl, which ended up being an extreme game script, like the absolute dud game between the Rams and the Patriots. I hit Julian Edelman 20-1 at MVP after being yelled at about how it was impossible for him to win MVP. So that felt good, but not as good as solo banking. So, my $20 bet on an offshore betting site wasn't quite as fulfilling as I'm sure Jester's. I think he had a no quarterback lineup.
It was, yeah. So the equivalent for this game would be the Cooper Cup, no QBs, a couple pass catchers in there, running back touchdown. Game goes under the total. I don't remember if he had a D in there or not, but they're definitely, it's an extreme game script, but it happens sometimes. And when it does, and you're right, it's definitely, it's rewarding to get that right.
Yeah, I'm envisioning, this isn't as crazy, but I could see like Akers captain with Cup and flex, no other Rams, and like bring back 4 Bengals, something like that. It's, obviously nothing quite at the level that Jester did. It's hard for me to see. It just seems like this game.
I mean, you could like plausibly see a Cup captain, Rams D is able to get after Burrow. They get 6-7 sacks, a couple turnovers. Akers or Sony Michel scores a touchdown. And then you've got a couple pass catchers or skill guys on the Bengals that, put up 12 to 15 points. Like there are scenarios where you can talk yourself into it. It's obviously low probability, but not entirely out of the question.
Yeah. I was also thinking about the Galbrain captain on the one side of the onslaught, which we've seen at times. I think Saquon Barkley did it.
James Robinson.
It's hard. It's hard for Cup to do that, though. I feel like maybe not. I don't know. I just feel like the way the Rams play, that like either Stafford or Akers would get in there, because like Akers is pretty cheap, but those alpha games on the team.
Yeah, Akers fumbling a couple times in the red zone 2 weeks ago, and then hurt last game. Like there's a path. I mean, Sony Michel is going to be one of those guys who's going to be 5 to 10%. Like talk about like hand building a lineup or using an optimizer. You don't want to build a deduping template to do some product ownership. It's way too much work. You just create like a group of these guys that are 15% or lower owned and have one of them in your lineups, and that's going to get you a low some product ownership, just the way that you structure. Kind of into Sony Michel for like the low owned lineups.
Cool. Yeah. And I'm like into playing the Bengals chasing, where I think people underestimate the amount of fantasy points the chasing team can get. Where the volume or the scoring is somewhat concentrated on the team that's winning, and they're more efficient. So sometimes like you're not racking up catches, you're not racking up plays. Like give me Cincinnati, like 70 plays, Burrow's throwing a bunch, and I don't care if he's just completing a bunch of 5-6 yard passes. A lot of Bengals can get there if he's going to have to complete a ton of those.
Yeah, you talk about how good those like 2-4 underdog heavy teams are. And a lot of the reason why is because they're cheaper. And when they're chasing, they're throwing more. And that's obviously good on PPR sites like DraftKings. So the underdog in this situation doesn't even need to necessarily win. Like you said, if they're chasing and racking up PPR volume, and then the other side is just condensed around Kupp and Stafford or Kupp and Akers, then you're in a really good spot.
Well, damn guys, I feel like we've covered a ton. Any other things you like want to get out there before we shut this down, either macro or specific to the Super Bowl?
No, it's good to finally pod with the guy that I've looked up to in the Showdown streets for a long time. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, the alt game script stuff is really good. I think it's really important. It's also just fun to think through. We talked about some of that, but getting yourself into these 4-2 underdog builds or 5-1 favorite builds, I think is a really good way to think about the Super Bowl, whether you're using an optimizer or hand building. Also kind of glossed over it a little bit, but Cody did just cover it. Think about the actual game script that happens when that scenario happens as well, right? Like you're not going to get Sony Michel as like the one ram on the comeback. You're probably going to get the pass catching back or the wide receivers in those lineups. And even if a team like San Francisco is a good example, they love to play run heavy when they're ahead, but they're willing to throw when they're behind. And so if you're playing an onslaught against the Niners, that's where you can get like Ayuk into those lineups. And I think those things still go overlooked a little bit just because it's hard to construct rules and parameters around those, but they're an important consideration.
I feel like all this talk makes me want a super galaxy brain to the point where I want to be like Evan Silva, hand in the dirt, and just like hand build a bunch of lineups in the MME contest so I can have full control over the gal brain projected game script of each lineup versus leaving it up to the opto gods.
But that's the problem with having 2 weeks, is like you can just be laying in bed and just like firing off lineups that are probably bad because you're not looking at projections or using an optimizer. Or as Levitan would say, you're just a phone shitter, bro. Like, that's where you get into problems.
I have a cousin who I've told him you cannot play like classic main slate DFS because he's like a casual football fan, has these super strong opinions, but like has no idea of value. But he somehow does well as a phone shitter lineup maker on these single showdown slates because he really funnels the energy of like one team's going to kill the other team.
Right.
And I think like just by falling into onslaughts, he's like actually kind of good at Showdown. It's insane.
That's
a tangent though. But yeah. Thanks so much, Drewby, for hopping on. You as well, Cody. Again, Cody's article is going to be up. He's got the Pro Bowl article up, God's game being played this weekend, if you want to check that out. But next week, he'll have the article everyone's really looking for the Super Bowl. We'll also do an Establish the Run Showdown episode on the main feed next week that's hyper specific to the Super Bowl. We're really going to get into the different strategies.
You got to check out Cody's stuff too. It just not blowing smoke up his ass, but his Showdown content is above and beyond, I think, anybody else's main slate content. So it's one man, but I think that the Twitter graphics and everything are incredible. It's really insightful stuff. And I think it's changed the way a lot of people have approached things. So hopefully one of us gets the big Super Bowl win, but I know Cody will steer people in the right direction.
High praise. After I end recording, though, these two are going to be bickering over who's actually going to win the $1 million between the two of them. But no, it's been awesome to have two Showdown goats on here. I think this can be a really helpful show for people. If you are on the main Establish the Run, again, this is podcast feed. This is a simulcast episode of Establish the Edge. You can check out my podcast on iTunes, Establish the Edge. They're also all uploaded to YouTube on the Establish the Run channel. Give us likes, whether it's on YouTube or iTunes. That helps a ton. Reviews, all that. Appreciate it. And good luck, everybody, in your Super Bowl Showdown contests.